Welcome to Macro Minds, where I talk to economists and other experts about the issues of our time. Hi, welcome to Macro Minds episode 6. I'm your host, Kallum Pickering, chief economist at Peel Hunt, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Giles Wilkes, specialist partner at Flint Global, senior fellow at the Institute for Government. But before that, did some other interesting stuff that I think.
Yeah.
Tell me what you've been up to.
I've had about 8 different business cards, so it depends on how far you're going to go back. So if we leave out garlic picking and secretarial temping and other stuff that might not be so relevant here, I spent 6.5 years in 2 different stints as a special advisor in the government, starting with Vince Cable from 2010 to 2014, basically advising on everything in the business department. But in the end, that meant a lot of industrial strategy, economics, and trying to keep Vince in the government, given that he was often quite critical of what was going on around him. There was a constant round of diplomacy to be doing. A couple of years at the Financial Times followed, and then, bizarrely for a Lib Dem, I got invited into the Downing Street of Theresa May to do industrial strategy, competition policy, consumers, energy, all sorts of stuff in there, and enjoyed that until the day before Boris Johnson arrived, and then I took up the positions you just described. But I also still get misty-eyed and nostalgic for 10 years I spent in the glorious and highly respectable business of spread betting that ended around 2006, where I picked up some of the understanding of the markets in the kind of pre-mobile phone era.
Okay, so the 2 things I think we'll be hoping to focus on. I picked up a couple of your great reports, which I recommend anyone interested in UK policy at the moment should read. First is from the Institute of Government Treasury, Orthodoxy, and then another 10 lessons for successful industrial strategy. And of course, as you probably know, we're meeting today in context of a bit of a wobble in UK bond markets. Mm-hmm. And reading the UK press, you would think this is almost entirely due to UK government decisions and what happened at the budget on the 30th of October. You know, I lean back a little. I cover international markets, and I mean, it's important for people to note 2 things. First, it's mainly the US Treasuries market, which is pushing up borrowing costs. What matters for the UK is the spread of UK rates versus other rates is widening, which suggests that markets are pricing in some additional premium. It's not huge, but that if you peer closely, you can see this gap. So I let's just start off with an open question. What's your sense on the current situation in the UK? And
okay, I mean, as a political economist, I can't help make the point that sounds a bit like a government line, but this is really reflecting the economy that this new government inherited.
That's right.
I mean, this new government inherited an economy kind of at its limits in terms of the supply side, at its fiscal limits, and in that sort of situation, almost any kind of a tremor, and Donald Trump coming into the White House again is more than just a tremor. Anything like that is likely to sort of disturb the numbers, such as to force the Treasury to have to think again in March, perhaps. So, yeah, I do think they're in an uncomfortable position. And the budget of October 2024, even if you think the broad macro call was right, in other words, it needed to raise taxes, it needed to restore a bit of public investment, it needed to restore public spending, it did all those things. Even if you think that call was right, it hasn't gone down well with business. They chose one of the more damaging taxes. I mean, no tax, maybe apart from land tax, is entirely harmless. But the employer nix is a pretty dangerous way to go. And we're seeing the effects in some of the surveys today and some of the accounts of how the economy's feeling right now. So it's a slightly dicey time. I would say, though, that we still fundamentally have a decent enough economy that it ought to be growing 1.5–2% in a normal year. And when that happens, hopefully, fingers crossed, a lot of the other numbers start seeming more manageable. But yeah, it's difficult times.
Yeah, I actually have a lot of sympathy for that view, and I must admit, I've been surprised at just how badly the budget has been taken by the press and among businesses. And I think it's important to just dig into the details of why that might be. You know, the Bank of England, the OBR, the consensus of city economists, including myself, the IMF, all said that the net effect of the budget decisions, the increase in taxes, the additional borrowing, and then the spending, investment focused, would boost economic growth. It would add to economic growth this year and next year.
Good to hear.
And the market, it is not happy about the budget. Businesses are not happy about the budget. But I can't help but think that the situation the UK is in is part of a product of a long period where markets have felt like their patience has been tested by policy decisions. And that leaves whoever is in government in a situation where they have to be additionally cautious in upsetting. It's kind of a bad case of PTSD, isn't it? After so much has happened.
And we've had a lot of tea recently, so yeah. So I mean, no, look, I totally agree, but it's very important to be specific, I think, about which markets we're talking about. We're mostly, if you look at the headlines of the last couple of weeks, we're talking about the gilts, 10 to 30-year borrowing costs having reached post-2008 highs. That's not a forecast about growth. We don't have a future nominal GDP market out there. So your basic analysis hasn't been proven wrong by gilts going down and yields shooting up. I mean, of course, an economy in deep trouble might exhibit that behavior, but you can't reason from just that single incident. And as you said at the beginning, that is a reflection of the interest rate environment internationally, largely driven by the United States. So that doesn't on its own say it was the wrong mix, they made the wrong call. What we have seen is a couple of months of poor GDP data, which are, as we all know, quite shonky nowadays. You're talking about like tiny little changes in one or two of the items
unrelated to the budget as well. I mean,
again, unrelated.
That data would have been weak without the budget.
Because after all, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the biggest item in the budget is coming in April. So unless you've got an incredibly large factor for expectations that sort of hits almost in retrospect, then there's no way that was because of the budget. Yep. So we've got to be quite careful what we can and can't blame the government for, while agreeing that in a politics-free world, we wouldn't have gone for employer NICs. We'd have gone for VAT or something.
I mean, my suspicion is this will actually self-correct. As soon as markets realise actually UK domestic demand, it's not racing ahead. Firms don't have huge amounts of pricing power. Currency is a little bit weak, but it's not as if we have to worry about imported inflation a lot. So the Bank of England's own model will factor in these higher benchmark borrowing costs and say weaker mortgage demand, weaker credit demand, weaker consumer spending, a little bit more saving. The risk here is actually that these rates slow growth and reduce inflation rather than that they produce a lot of inflation. And the market is prone to self-correct. My hunch is this will wash out. But people are asking, do you think the government will breach its fiscal rules and have to make a policy change?
Well, it's possible because your invitation to me onto this podcast made me go out and look up the figures, and the OBR in its most recent economic and fiscal report, I think put it at something like a 1.3 percentage point rise in interest rates across the curve would translate into something like 23 billion pounds of extra fiscal pressure, all other things being equal. And we've seen about half of that since October. So that would suggest the headroom, which was about £10 billion, might now be entirely wiped out. Of course, that ceteris paribus caveat is very important. If your interest rates are shooting up because nominal growth has got a bit stronger, because perhaps you're right and public investment is going to raise nominal growth, then maybe some of that comes back in tax revenue.
That's right.
The other point I saw, partly because I follow your excellent Twitter feed, which everyone should, you retweeted a really good point from Chris Giles, which is that most of these short-term fluctuations off trend, the Bank of England and the OBR will both assume that the economic capacity of the country hasn't changed. So if we've fallen a bit short of it, that means we ought to have more easing to bring us up to that point. So it's not permanent. It won't necessarily hit the absolute critical year of 2029, which is when a lot of these fiscal rules bite. Yeah. So, it's not welcome. The Treasury would love it if we'd seen falling interest rates. But it doesn't mean that no permanent verdict has been made on this economy or this budget.
That's right. And it's a strange world that we're in, to put it mildly. There's lots of risks and lots of uncertainties. And you're slightly preaching to the choir. We mentioned before on the call, you thought UK trend growth is probably around 1.5%. I think it might even be a little bit higher than that. We don't have a demographic problem. We should benefit from AI. There's reasons to be optimistic. It's just we have been disturbed by so many unusual shocks for such a long period. It's reasonable to say at least short-term potential growth for a while after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the gas shock was probably zero. Given that we had so much nominal spending growth, if it was higher, we would have had more real growth. And so we're coming from such a low baseline, and fundamentals aren't bad. If the weird stuff could stop, the economy would actually do okay.
Yeah.
And well,
I mean, I'd love to ask you, if in 2015 you were told by some genie in a lamp that it predicted for you exactly what was going to happen. We were going to have a Brexit referendum, a huge shock to expectations, which did damage a lot of investment. Then a pandemic. We had Boris Johnson as the Prime Minister, Donald actual Trump as the President. Then after the pandemic, we'd have this land war in Europe that would send gas prices spiraling up to 10 times their figures. If you'd then guessed what the economy would do, you might not have guessed as strongly as it went.
That's exactly right. So yeah, and I started to inquire a couple of years ago why the economy had consistently surprised to the upside over that period. It's not to say that there are two kinds of upside surprises. People expect things to be good and it's even better, or people expect things to be really bad and it's not quite as bad. That was certainly true during COVID. I mean, analysts was sort of coming up with as many alphabet forecasts as they could. It's an L-shaped recovery. The consensus was that it would take 5 years to recover from COVID. The economy bounced back within 18 months. We didn't have the recession after the Brexit vote. We didn't have a major recession after the interest rate and inflation spike. So my question was, why are we so consistently wrong? And my suspicion is that the balance sheet side of the economy is just so strong on the private side. Banks are really well capitalized. Household businesses, manageable debts, they're stuffed with cash. And this balance sheet strength has acted as a buffer against these shocks, and will eventually be a balance sheet, a springboard for recovery once the shocks fade. But we need to get to that point when the shocks start to fade.
I think it's a really good point in that it's very fashionable nowadays to see the 14 years after 2010 as entirely wasted. But one thing that did happen was the banks were strengthened.
That's right.
I mean, imagine if this pandemic had hit with the bank balance sheets in the position they were in 2011 or 2009, goodness help us. So, some things are strong about this economy. It's still a relatively good economy for sort of reallocating resources, not as good as the United States. Yep. But, the flexibility is there. And so you would expect eventually things to fade into the background. It's just takes a long while to get over these shocks. I still think we're getting over the great financial crisis shock in some way.
I think that's right. And I think there's perhaps a broader point which to make is the UK is a medium-sized open economy. Mm-hmm. The weather in the global economy affects us an awful lot, and I think even though we're such an exposed open economy, we often look towards home a lot for the sources of blame for the economic problems, when in fact just the mere issue that the world has just changed. So if you think about the heydays, the last golden period for the UK, the 80s and the early 90s, we set our economy up in a world of globalization, financial liberalization, peace, and rapid gains in the populations of skilled labor around the world, namely Europe. And when you work through those trends, well, we've reversed the financial liberalization. We had to after the global financial crisis. Trade barriers have risen, partly self-inflicted through Brexit. Yeah. The world has become less peaceful. And so now suddenly we're much more vulnerable to these global commodity shocks. We had a big one in 2022.
Yeah, we've lost the oil dividend. We went from having an oil surplus at some point in that period to a deficit.
We lost the peace dividend, which mattered a lot, certainly through the 90s. And so we can say, well, fundamentals are good and we've had some weird stuff happen, but fundamentally, if you stripped all of that away, our potential growth is lower than it once was.
Yeah, we had tailwinds and we maybe didn't realise it. You don't realise when you're sailing in tailwinds. You think it's all down to your skill.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so the question is, what happens next? And I want to turn, if I can, to government policy and your...
Oh yes,
Treasury orthodoxy, yes. And we like our macro minds to not just focus on the economics, but also to focus on a little history where we can. And I thought this great quote from the Marquis of Salisbury might introduce this chat.
He says, I will tell my co-author he was very proud of that.
It's a fantastic quote. So, by exercising the power of the purse, the Treasury claims a voice in all decisions of administrative authority and policy. I think that much delay and many doubtful resolutions have been the result of the peculiar position which, through many generations, the Treasury has occupied.
Much delay. That is a very good point. A lot does get delayed because the Treasury is at the heart of everything.
What do we mean by Treasury orthodoxy?
Okay, that's a really good question. I mean, the Treasury orthodoxy has been quite well defined in a couple of really excellent speeches from now Lord Nicholas Macpherson, the former permanent secretary to the Treasury, where he's sort of set out the basic principles. And a lot of people would call them the Washington consensus. Markets work, debt is bad, sound money is really, really important. The skill of the people in the Treasury is really important, but basically it boils down to it's really important for the Treasury to keep control of things. But effectively, in order to create the conditions for good free market growth to take place. So do not try to grow the economy through excess demand creation would be sort of part of it. The supply side matters is a really big part of this. And some of this would be quite new. If you asked what the Treasury orthodoxy was in the 60s, it was Keynesian. Mm-hmm. And but that idea of it being at the centre and in control would have been perennial, even going back to Winston Churchill in the 20s when he said he wished finance was less proud and industry more content. The sense that the Treasury sort of valued the soundness of the pound more than the expansion of business, which is at the core also of the criticisms that you get out there, that when people say the Treasury is wrong or is can be explained for actually weak economic growth, despite saying very clearly we really want economic growth and we want to pursue it in every way possible, it's because they think there's something else more important to the Treasury, which is the soundness of the finances, which means they favour sort of weak demand growth, weak public spending over speculative but more risky and more growth-friendly policies. So the accusation that pamphlet was written to sort of take on was that the idea that the Treasury was the reason that we didn't have great expansionary, pro-growth, innovative policies, which was at that time coming from the mouth of Liz Truss, and therefore had a bit of a conspiratorial bent to it, but also could be heard from quite a few civil servants and other insiders who would say you can't believe how sort of constricting it is, constantly having to get things past this bunch of often quite junior but very rigid and powerful officials.
I'm just looking at the list here from the Macpherson report and just echoing a lot of the things you've just said about belief in free trade, confidence that markets work, sound money, skepticism about using public spending to regulate demand, important to the supply side. A lot of these things are essentially consensus. These are the things you need to push forward. It sounds as much that it's not too little treasury. Excuse me, too much treasury that's the problem, but too little. Is that
it's
the
one
wrong
of
way
the
to
great questions of our time. I mean, if you were writing in 2016-17 after 7 years of nominal GDP growth at around 3.25%, you might say, have they been insufficiently imaginative about the demand side? I'd criticise that perhaps, that maybe there have been times when others, I mean, Labour thinkers all through have been saying, yeah, free trade's great, but you've got to be sceptical about it, that sometimes free trade generates unfair results, it sometimes generates too much volatility, sometimes it generates insufficient investment, the short-termism that the city is fairly or unfairly accused of comes from this excessive naive belief in free trade. So some of that stuff has been criticised, but on the whole, I think it's a good bedrock. Put it this way, if you want a finance department, do you want the finance department to be the craziest guy in the room going, hey, we've got some great ideas, why don't we build a spaceport on the Isle of Wight? You don't want those people. That pressure is going to be coming from all of the rest of government. You want the finance department has a really important role in kind of holding the rein. And so, in a sense, it sounds like I wrote this thing in order to determine what I thought was fair and unfair. And people accusing the Treasury of being unfair because it's acting like a finance department are really missing the point. A finance department has to be sceptical, and it has to be thinking all the time about how you fit a quart into a pint pot, because the pressures from all the other dozens of departments are all in one direction towards more spending. So ultimately, we think there are good institutional reasons why the Treasury should act that way towards spending in particular, but there's really important power imbalances within Whitehall that nevertheless distort economic policy.
Okay, so before we move to those, is it worth just emphasising two additional points? First, the culture within the Treasury always has in mind that Britain has a habit of crises, not just more recently, but going into the past. But then when it really needs to adjust and move quickly, say during the pandemic with things like the furlough scheme,
Mm-hmm.
or during the 2008 global financial crisis, money is made available very, very quickly.
Yeah. I think this is a very good point. We have had a series of devaluation crises and even banking crises. There was a Barings banking crisis in the first few years of the 20th century where you needed the Treasury to be extremely swift. And we tend to be, the criticism is we're great at crisis, we're bad at steady policy making. So we can, when it comes to it, hustle all the resources together. Like, you know, the budgets that we had to pass at the late 60s in order to forestall another sterling crisis after the devaluation of 1967, for example. It was useful having a really powerful Treasury that could basically lay down the law, raise revenues, cut lots of taxes, and bring about a trade surplus, effectively, which is what we were needed. But what the trouble is, retaining the option at the centre at any time to cut back on spending or raise taxes exports the uncertainty throughout the rest of the system. So if for a long-term program of investment, you need the certainty that the money will be coming year after year after year. It won't be down to bilateral negotiations with the most powerful department in Whitehall in every year of it. If you can't plan, you cannot plan a long-term investment if you think, well, I'm not sure that the Secretary of State in 6 years' time is going to win this argument, because investors in the real world need to know the money is really going to be there. So optionality for the Treasury that makes it great at a crisis might lead to more uncertainty in the rest of the system.
So, which brings us to the current situation.
Yep.
The problems that Rachel Reeves may be facing with the Treasury today, what might they be?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, one of the things we find in this report, interviewing people going back to at least John Major's time, but certainly New Labour's and
perhaps
so on.
actually just tell people how you came with the analysis in this.
Well, we interviewed lots of former Treasury officials, current Treasury officials, former special advisors, like well-known ones for within the New Labour period, and advisors to George Osborne and so on, all to get a sense not just of what is the sort of written rules, the stuff you see in famous documents like the Green Book, but also, you know, the real politic of how things operate within the Treasury. And from those interviews, we just picked up lots and lots of themes and ran with it. And one of the absolutely key themes was the Treasury is the most politically responsive department in Whitehall, without doubt. It's the one that thinks constantly about what the Chancellor wants and wants to deliver that. Now, if the Chancellor is exactly of the same mind as this Treasury orthodoxy, you may not notice this, but a Chancellor that comes in and says, I see the way you operate and I want to build on it and change it, can do so. This is what Gordon Brown did. Gordon Brown came in and said, look, we believe in the end of boom and bust and fiscal and monetary orthodoxy and all of that stuff, but I also want you to take these other public service and social objectives really seriously. And the Treasury did respond to that. As a result, the Treasury kind of expanded. It became powerful across the economy. He took it much further into the supply side. In the business department, when I started in 2010 there, the memories of the Treasury effectively writing down their agenda and saying, you're going to deliver this policy on enterprise or competition or company law was still quite strong, because the Treasury does respond to what the politician wants. So I don't believe that Rachel Reeves has a problem with, doing my air quotes here, the Treasury, in that Rachel, if she decides that she wants the Treasury to be a creature in favour of industrial strategy, can make it so. She has some excellent advisors in there who fully understand what she means by that. So she needs, I mean, she might need to pay more attention to the way the sort of some of the longer toothed officials still feel about this stuff. But really, it is a department that wants to do what the Chancellor wants it to do. And so she doesn't have a problem with the Treasury so much. I would say, though, that if you do have an agenda of public sector reform and spreading AI through the economy and industrial strategy and so forth, it can't all be worked out in the brainiest, most powerful department and then just handed out like homework to everybody else. It means a cooperative system where people work together, whereas this mission-based policy of Labour is taken kind of seriously, not just, it can't all be still, I don't really care what everyone else thinks, what does this or that Treasury official think? It does need to be a more cooperative system within the government, because it's just impossible for one quite small department to do it all.
Do you think the Treasury would be in favour of moving to one fiscal statement per year?
Yeah, they'd love to. I even remember reading a Tim Harford column from early Coalition where he said one every 2 years, and I think they'd cheer that too. I mean, fiscal statements, or fiscal decision points like a budget are enormous sources of volatility. There's
right.
a demand for baubles and gimmicks and rabbits and so forth. I think that it's nobody would run a system like that. The trouble is, it's one of the few times that all the voters turn on the TV and notice what the Chancellor and the government is doing. So it's very difficult for the political side to give up that opportunity.
I mean, the challenge from a business point of view is planning around this, when twice a year there's the potential for some substantial change in policy that may affect your business. The incentive is just to wait.
Yeah,
and you have to have some sympathy for government, I suspect. But by this point, they would have thought the market will have processed the budget, businesses will have processed the budget. We can now move on to some of these other things. And in fact, the pressure is for government to start signaling whether it might make changes in spring as a result of potential violations to fiscal rules. And so you have this very difficult institutional situation where, based on targets 4 to 5 years out, and all forecasts are basically guesses, with huge error terms in there, you're being encouraged to change policy today, twice a year. It becomes a tangled situation. And so I think once a year would be absolutely the way to go. Did we ever do it just once a year, or has it always been a twice a year?
I think so. I think probably it came in with Gordon Brown that we started getting, I think they would have called it the pre-budget report back then. Mm-hmm. And the pre-budget report then became like a budget. I mean, the one in 2008, for example, had to be. I mean, imagine the difference between March 2008 and November 2008.
And where does the OBR sit within this?
Well, the OBR does sit at a proper remove in that it evaluates the effects of policies. It needs a decent head start to do this because there are often hundreds of them and they need careful evaluation. And it produces a fiscal verdict on them. So I think it's not one of the many sort of weird paranoid fantasies of Liz Truss and others. They were somehow pulling the strings. They were just trying to reflect what the effect of government policies were going to be, so that those 4 or 5 year forecasts were as robust as they could be, with your caveat in mind.
So, just to bring some of this together, so the Treasury functions, when it functions well, to essentially filter policies which could lead to market crises, unexpected economic shocks due to hasty political decisions, operates well within a crisis, but then during the good years, potentially could be a little bit more imaginative. And it would be helpful if we reduced the number of fiscal statements we have, just to accept the fact that the world is uncertain and planning does take time. The government has an industrial strategy.
Yes. Information, I think it's fair to say.
Information. So what's the current situation?
The current situation is that around the 14th of October last year, they released a green paper, which means a consultation paper, called Invest 2035, that set out 8 large sectors that it regarded as growth sectors. Now, if you want to know what growth sector mean, I mean, the typical way of thinking it is this is a sector that could grow a lot and we could do really well at, and therefore it'd be better if we were more into that sector. I think there's another important angle to this, which is what they call foundational or maybe enabling sectors. So energy is a great example. If we could be much, much better at energy, it might not mean necessarily a bigger sector, but it would be a huge benefit to the rest of the economy. Likewise, AI and digital and construction. There are some sectors that if you do better at them, the whole economy benefits. And the government analysts that I know are hard at work making sure that is really robustly defined. They've put out the consultation to say, okay, within these 8 sectors, which are the areas, the subsectors that are of particular interest, that where we should put our actual focus. And then they want to deploy as wide a range of government tools to bear on the interests of those sectors. And the underlying theory here is, I mean, we all believe in free markets. The magic of growth really does come from free markets. That's not just some sort of dewy-eyed business rep statement. The only reason things grow is because markets have got this incredible way of working out where advantages should be found and reallocating resources and moving people between jobs and all that wonderful magical stuff. And the government is not planning on getting involved in all of that like some giant Goz plan. What it is doing is trying to identify where there are areas where government policy can make a really big difference because of the nature of that sector. So energy is, again, a classic example. We're not going to transition to net zero just by having a high carbon price and a lot of hope. We're going to need to have sector specific plans because of the specific needs of particular parts of that. So, I mean, classically, we need energy grid connections for certain parts of it. We need the certainty that comes from having a fixed price for future offshore wind. We need technological innovation in certain parts of it. We need like changes to the housing fabric. We need all sorts of things that aren't going to just happen through the free market, but they need to do that analysis in a highly skeptical way. They need to be aware that every part of the economy is going to beat a path to their door saying, we're special, we need a bit of help. We could do with a meeting or a consultation and then leading to a tax break that helps us along. And in most cases, the answer really should be no. The answer should be no. You're doing fine. You're the hospitality sector or the retail sector, whatever. I know you have your horizontal issues, you know, your concerns about planning or manpower or so forth, but you don't need a strategy from us. You just need the conditions within which you operate to be absolutely fine, which we will do. So the industrial strategy sectors are the ones that need some special strategic long-term commitment, involvement and interaction with the government. And so they should be an important part of the economy, but not necessarily the great majority of the economy.
You mentioned energy as a point of focus.
Yeah.
What's an optimistic outlook for UK energy?
I guess the optimistic outlook would be, well, we are committed to net zero, and we decarbonise the electricity system in a timely and cost efficient way, which means that the sort of declining cost curves that we enjoyed until recently on offshore wind continues, and so carry on solar. We start getting better at installing nuclear. There's a whole department for looking at this stuff, but we need to become much better at the planning and infrastructure delivery side of that if we're going to get that. Because if we have expensive energy, the rest of the economy is going to be in a lot of trouble.
And when you and part of this is just dramatically increasing domestic energy production.
Yeah, electricity in particular. Because basically electricity is the only. There's no other large scale form of energy that we're going to rely on. So
because we you know when you look at the sectors, I notice here in digital and technology, what a lot of the tech companies are saying, certainly around AI, is this is extremely energy hungry technology, and it needs basic things like water to cool data centers, and so we think about technology as if it's something that's on a computer, but actually underlying that, it's all of this stuff is obeying the laws of physics, like cars and manufacturing plants.
It's come as a huge shock. I don't know whether if we'd done this 4 years ago, we'd have thought that AI, which was a big popular topic of discussion, the energy needs of AI would have been so prominent. But the sheer expense of training up these models has really taken people by surprise. And I do think, William Hague wrote in the Times yesterday that everything should be abandoned for AI. AI should be front of the list for everything. I think it's actually a classic constrained optimization problem. I don't think AI should necessarily get all of the energy just because AI is incredible. We should be weighing up all the other needs for energy. We need to heat our houses. We need to have industrial heat. We need we need to heat the entire fleet of EVs that is going to be.
We need to build more houses as well,
we need to do
huge amounts of energy.
So, we're energy as the unit that needs to be sort of maximized over is going to be a really big topic over the years. And you're right that AI is an area of big potential, particularly for this industrial strategy, but its deployment is going to be very important. Your normal SME using the best-in-class digital techniques to improve their productivity is going to be as much a part of the growth story as being the person who invents the next iteration of some large language model.
And when we say industrial strategy, we're really thinking about the supply side of the economy. Yes. We're of course two economists here, so often when we're talking about money, we're really talking about demand issues. Right? Yeah. When we're talking about industrial, we're really talking about the supply side of the economy. And one thing that we continue to hear from government, and actually it's probably where there seems to be some consensus right across the political spectrum in the UK, is that regulations could be set in a more growth-friendly way. Mm-hmm. Does that play a part in the industrial strategy?
It's certainly going to be one of the areas of sort of consultation and focus, because obviously, in a trivial sense, it really could. For example, if we need more utility investment, the regulators could quite literally change the regulatory settlements to tilt them towards more investment. I mean, it just doesn't come cheap. It means somebody's got to pay for it through the bills. So, for example, you can do that. But also, I mean, more broadly speaking, regulators could be much more responsive to companies in terms of like realizing their issues are important and dealing with them quickly so that they reduce the uncertainty that comes from regulation. I'm sure that with the best will in the world, even the most sort of well set up arm's length regulators could sometimes be a bit better at treating the firms like customers. And sometimes I guess there are, the classic red tape issues where we've passed some law to do something and we haven't gone back and audited whether it is doing something, but it is costing a lot of paper filling out. And that could be sort of corrected. It's real thankless work, but the government has a lot of incredibly thankless bodies set up to look at this, called things like the Better Regulation Executive or the Regulatory Policy Committee or goodness knows. So, yeah, they ought to get on with that.
Yeah. So, sounds like you're an optimist.
Yeah.
By the end of this parliament, are we in a better place than we are today?
Yeah, because I think the course we were on before was bad in a number of ways. I don't mean, this is not a political podcast, and these were not meant to be political points, but we were focusing our efforts on things like performative policies like the Rwanda scheme, like trying to pursue trade deals that were not particularly big in real terms compared to the big trading partner we've got right on our shores. We were optimistically hoping to achieve public sector efficiencies without really checking that the public services weren't falling over, which then has an effect on growth. I think the basic theme that we had gone a bit too far in terms of public sector austerity and need to restore it a little bit, which is in the sort of instincts of Labour thinkers, is broadly correct for now. So I personally wanted a government that was likely to be a bit more fiscally generous and pursue public goods and restore them a little bit while still respecting the market as the driver of growth. And I think that's broadly speaking what we're going to have. And, if, God willing, we have 5 years without crises, that ought to mean a better 4 or 5 years than we've had before.
That's right. So a little bit of luck to get through the next few weeks and months. There are some various global issues politically and geopolitically, which could shape outcomes in markets and influence domestic policy. Hopefully not. We get to the middle of the year, the net effect of the fiscal expansion should start to add to economic growth.
Yeah.
We knock on wood and hope that we have a settled 2 or 3 years, at least in the UK, and then we can start working through some of these industrial strategy issues. And I think to the point where we started, and it's where you and I agree, if we're right about underlying growth just being a bit stronger than most people expect, once we return to that, it will take the pressure off a lot of these issues.
Yeah.
We'll be able to lighten up and with clearer vision, probably assess and put a proper perspective on some of these issues. It's just, and I say this sitting in UK equity markets where it's been really tough. We've been hopeful year after year that things are going to get easier, and then there's just something else. And so I think that's why people are a little nervous, and I think why they've reacted with so much caution to the budget. And
you know what? It's the way of things. I'm old enough to remember how it felt in the early 90s when I was kind of graduating in economics myself. We thought in 93, 94 that we were a basket case.
Yeah.
We were the sick man of Europe. We just had this debacle of Black Wednesday and the falling out of the ERM. We had a deficit that didn't seem to be soluble, and the Tory government was in shambles and was losing budget votes about things like VAT on fuel. We thought we were in a real deep pit. It turns out we were actually enjoying Goldilocks growth and didn't really realise it. Black Wednesday had been a triumph. And things were going well. It never feels like that at the time. We maybe focus too much on month by month data, and there will always be bleak moments.
Well, I think that's a great point to end on. It's been wonderful catching up. I feel
really
like we could have spoke for 2 hours. We covered a lot. Well, the way we like to end things on the podcast is, where can people find you, Giles?
Well, I have recently shifted mostly from Twitter, where I was at Giles EB, to Blue Sky, where it's at Giles YB on Blue Sky. So that's where I'm mostly putting my thoughts about what my dog's just done or the latest economic figures. And so find me there. I intend to use LinkedIn a bit more, but I think I'm just not serious enough.
No, I think some words of wisdom would be welcome on LinkedIn. Thank you so much again. It's been a real pleasure.